We're delighted to have you join us here for our first of our Defining Cognitive Science series for the fall. And at the outset, I just want to pass on good wishes from Steve DePaula, our Director in Cognitive Science. Unfortunately, he's not able to be here because he's wanted on another campus, and that's kind of the thing of wearing multiple hats. So he wishes he was here and asked if I would introduce the series in his stead. I should say, okay, it's billed as Women in Cognitive Science, and a few words on that. The series evolved in its usual way, actually. We had 5 possible speakers, and 2 suggested they'd prefer to present in the spring. And as it happens, those 2 were men. So it left us with 3 confirmed women speakers, and so the theme suggested itself. So Steve made a few phone calls, and as a result, we have a series of 5 diverse and interesting researchers who will share their work with us over the coming weeks. So the concept of women in cognitive science in this case is an opportunity to celebrate and to illustrate for students considering cognitive science the breadth and possibility of this broad area of study of cognitive science. To introduce today's speaker and to moderate your questions afterwards, I've asked Christine McKenzie to come up. And I know Christine McKenzie is an active member of our Cognitive Science Steering Committee over the years of 2005, 6, 7. And she was always encouraging, full of energy, generous with her knowledge and experience, having served the SFU community in various capacities over the years. Dr. McKenzie is Professor Emerita at SFU in Biomedical Physiology and Kinesiology. Her area of expertise is human movement, grasping, and remote manipulation. Most recently, she co-authored a paper on human haptics and experimental investigations using computer graphics and haptic devices. And she has NSERC funding still and enjoys attending conferences, submitting papers, mentoring junior scholars, for any of you interested, and collaborating with colleagues in Canada, US, Japan, and New Zealand. And she also says she loves being a snowbird in this transitional phase of retirement. Christine.
So it's great to be here, and I'm happy to see cognitive men as well as cognitive women here interested in today's speaker. And it's my honor and pleasure today to introduce to you Linda Kaastra. Is it Kaastra? Yes, sorry. And Linda comes from us as a visiting scientist who's currently with the Magic Lab at the University of British Columbia, the Media and Graphics Interdisciplinary Center. She is a specialist in qualitative research design. She's also a specialist in human music performance, both as a performer and as one who studies cognition. So I think we're very fortunate to have you with us. Here she's currently doing some contracts with the engineering department or faculty of engineering at Purdue University. I'm not sure whether it's a faculty or department there, which department. Her research focuses on cognitive science of human interaction in novel environments and with a special interest in music performance. Her background was initially as a musician, as a bassoonist, and maybe you'll tell us a little bit about that as well. She did her BA at UBC and then a master's in Yale, all in music performance. She spent some time at the Banff School of Fine Arts and at SUNY Stony Brook. In New York as studying music performance as a practicing bassoonist, I guess. And she's going to talk to us today about annotation and cognition in music performance. So welcome, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. I'd like to also thank Steve and Shamina for helping me bring here to present this work to you. I'm very fond about this research, and I love sharing it, and I hope you find something interesting, points for discussion later. Today I'll be talking about some of my research on coordination in Western art music ensemble performance. This research began with an instrumental case study of the preparation and performance of Toru Takemitsu's Masque for Two Flutes. 2 professional flutists, both returning to grad school after some time out performing and teaching, agreed to allow me to videotape their entire process of rehearsing and performing this work. The data collection took place in a cognitive systems lab in the spring of 2005 and at the School of Music at UBC in the fall of 2005. The case study was instrumental, not because they were playing flutes, but because I expected their rehearsals to provide some insight into how complex music is coordinated. Before we get into the research, I'd like to share a performance or a part of a performance of this piece that I found on YouTube. These are not the performers in my study, but it's a very good performance. They did not publicize their names, so I can't tell you who they are. I'm going to have a little bit of the score up on the screen for you to follow along. For those of you that can read music, for those of you who can't read music, what you might want to try and do while you're listening is to find the beat, to tap along, or just see what you can sense about the music. Okay, that's just sort of the first section of the first movement, to familiarize you a bit. Now, this excerpt of the rehearsal score shows you a much dirtier version than the online score from YouTube. You can see the extensive marking that was used by the flutists in rehearsals for this piece. There's beat marks all the way through, time signature corrected, crossed out, dynamic markings changed, some triangles indicating subdivisions, braces, notes written in, words written in. These marks, if understood correctly in the context in which they were made, can tell us a lot about the process of coordinating the music. Megan Wingett, in her comprehensive ethnographic study of annotation in music performance, found that professional chamber musicians, such as the two musicians in this study, annotate their music far more extensively, making more marks per page than less experienced or even large ensemble players. So while I cannot account for the relative lack of pencil marks on the published YouTube score that you just saw, I can say that the amount of marking you see here is no indication of less training or less skill on the part of the flutists. It's simply an opportunity for us to study the inner mechanics of ensemble performance. So the first analysis of this qualitative data was undertaken using grounded theory. So I'll just go back and remind you, the qualitative data, again, was videotapes of all of their rehearsals. Every rehearsal and performance they did was under my work. Some of you may know grounded theory methodology, maybe? Some? No? Okay. Basically, the aim of this approach is to build theory that has explanatory power for the experiences of participants under study. So theory that is grounded in the reality of the participants. Grounded theory requires a careful collection of data that is likely to be meaningful for a particular question, but it forbids the use of existing theory, at least initially, for making sense of the data. So, as you heard a little bit earlier, I'm a bassoonist with considerable experience performing and with considerable training. And my interest in this research, in music performance, is to build and acquire theory that extends from training quite naturally, asking the kinds of questions I might ask as a bassoonist, bringing findings that I might think are relevant to rehearsals back with me. So I'm looking to build cognitive theory that we can take back into rehearsal and use to help us understand what is going on or how we might make improvements to our ensemble skill. I began by establishing a suitable ontological perspective for the project, so I haven't got the time to get into all of that mess. That was in the beginning of my work, but one example question is, what is real about gesture in the performance environment? So if we begin to answer that question by reading existing theory in this area, we might think that bodily gesture is the product of a musical idea. We might focus on the connections between emotion and gesture, gesture and musical meaning, and ultimately work to link body motion to musical material. Grounded theory doesn't let us use existing theory. Rather, grounded theory asks us to develop theory by systematically examining relevant data from real rehearsals. And when we study the body motion of performers learning a complex work, as I did in this study, the emphasis shifts from body motion as musical meaning to body motion as communicative interaction based on shared goals for performance. So bodily gesture, and these were my findings basically from the grounded theory study. Bodily gesture is a function of the communicative interaction of the performers. Gesture is subject to the following constraints: context, process, proximity, performance goals, and ensemble roles. Now, I'm sure that not many of you are familiar with the entire literature on gesture and music making, but this kind of turns a lot of that work on its head, because it's saying, you know, when I play and move as a performer, it's not just because I'm interpreting something musically, it's because I'm responding to a whole world of performance issues. However, once I had worked through my initial findings, I was ready to seek out a suitable theoretical framework for making further sense of the data. That was about as far as I could go as a bassoonist in theorizing from that work. So based on this work, I came to use Herbert Clark's joint activity theory as a framework for looking at the data. Are any of you familiar with Herbert Clark's work? Some of you are? Okay, great. Joint activity theory is a comprehensive theory of language use with frequent references to music, whose author is also an amateur musician. And because our time is short, I cannot delve into the conceptual depth of joint activity theory. I will limit the discussion to some of what he says about coordination. However, even this is condensed. According to Herbert Clark, in his 1996 book, Using Language, coordination is possible when individuals are able to read the same message in a jointly salient perceptual event, and both know how to respond to that message. Furthermore, both individuals know that both of them know how to respond to the jointly salient perceptual event. This is different than simply predicting what another person will do. We know what the other person sees and what we see, and we know what it means for them because we share common ground. So to give you an example, a very good example, the flutists in my study had 40 years of training between them. This training involves how to play an instrument, how to interpret the music, and how to behave in an ensemble setting. So in short, they've built up a considerable common ground in terms of reading the same message in jointly salient perceptual events in the context of rehearsal and performance. I'm focusing on the mechanics of how they devise coordination keys to get them through the learning of this complex work. So I used joint activity theory in my dissertation to come up with 4 domains of coordination relevant for my data. So this is the conceptualization. A domain of coordination is an area that includes a set of keys that is mutually recognizable to both performers. For 2 people, A and B, it is common ground that P, if and only if, A and B have some information that basis B holds. B indicates to A and B that A and B have information that B holds. And B indicates to A and B that P. So the bases that I selected for this data were, number one, the work, in this case represented by the musical score. The second was the annotations, which provided an additional layer of coordination for the flutist. The third area was body motion, and in my dissertation I focused mostly on body motion. Today I'm going to talk mostly about annotation. But also the conventions of performance. Those are all those things that flutists learn over those 20 plus years of performing and training about how to understand and how to convey their understanding to other people. So coordination can also be studied at different scales, all of which can be shown to influence the activity of making music. So on a large scale, we can say that social coordination is what brings musicians into the same space to learn and perform a work. The performers agree to participate in a social system and have a pretty good idea what the system expects them to do. They coordinate, performance activity based on context, audience expectation, schools of performance, and so on. Coordination over time focuses on the process of rehearsing a work within the ensemble. This includes the study of the role that specific keys for coordination play in the rehearsal process. Keys like annotation, clapping, tapping, singing, discussing, and playing the music as part of regular rehearsal activities. Coordination is also studied and measured in real time. How, in the words of one of the flutists in my study, how we make visible aspects of our intentions that are useful for a coordinating ensemble. In my dissertation, this included studying body motion, measuring it over time. But it can also include looking at breath, measuring breath and sound, and so on. Finally, we can also study coordination in the person-instrument system, which is an area that we're very familiar with. How experiences are cultivated, how meaning is made, how we think with and through our instruments, and so on. The research I'm talking about today is all looking at the area of coordination over time, how we build common ground, how we learn to coordinate the music through rehearsal. At this point, I'd like to draw your attention to the only other classification of annotations I've found. So there's only two researchers have looked at this, in other words, me and one other person. Megan Wingett has done an ethnographic study of annotation in music performance. Wingett was drawing on Starr and Griesemer's 1989 theory of boundary objects for the perspective she was taking on that material. In her study, the score is viewed as a standardized type boundary object, a communicative artifact that conveys meaning across relevant communities. She classifies annotations by mode, text, symbol, and number, and function, technical, conceptual, or somewhere fuzzy category of technical conceptual. Because her analysis is based on the communicative value of the score and annotations, it cannot delve very clearly into the function of the annotations, and she recognizes this limitation in her article. So for this work, I propose studying the score as a coordination device, or as David Kirsch would say, a persistent external representation, a shareable object of thought, rather than a communicative artifact. This slight shift in perspective allows for a greater understanding of the function of annotations in coordinating performance activity. It shifts the unit of analysis from the communicative contents of the score or marking to the relation between the score or annotation and the performer's activities as shareable objects of thought. To do this analysis, I had to take into account not only the pencil mark, but when it was made in the rehearsals and why. Also, whether or not the marking was necessary for performance, which I will discuss later. Because I was present and recorded and carefully studied all of the rehearsal data, and because I shared enough common ground with the flutists as an ensemble performer myself, I was able to categorize the annotations more specifically with respect to their role in coordinating the performance. If I'd just been handed the marked score, not having studied the full data, I wouldn't have had sufficient information to perform this analysis. And that's one of the benefits of qualitative research, even if it can be overwhelming at times. The amount of data you have is overwhelming, but it also allows you to do some things that are not possible through other methodologies. So this is a basic breakdown of the categorization of annotations. I'll go into more detail on each category in a minute, but the overview is this. The largest category of annotations, the largest number of annotations, were the performance anchor type. These annotations hold a place on the score for cognitive activity. So these marks include beat marks, braces, and triangles, and that's the largest set over there. The second largest group of annotations are those that demonstrate the coordination of metacognitive processes during rehearsal. These include monitoring, repair, correction, and evaluating performance as it progresses. These annotations include words such as, like words in letters, slow, hold. They can also include arrows. We'll look at some more examples of those in a minute. The smallest category of annotations were very pragmatic, marks whose aim was simply to make an existing part of the score more visually salient. And again, I'll talk more about that in a minute. So we're studying coordination over time. The annotations provide insight into cognitive processes during rehearsal and performance. I'll now give some more information on these different categories with some examples from my data so you can see where they're placed. Performance anchors are annotations that demonstrate direct links from cognitive activity to marks on the score. You'll see two varieties of performance anchors in the clips that follow. I think we're talking mostly about beat marks here. This is from the second rehearsal, still very early in the rehearsal process. You'll hear Jessica say, "I want some lines," and then she'll explain the marks as they're being added. And let's just listen to this for a minute.
The line again?
Yeah. And I want some lines.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mark.
1. God, where did they go? 2.
Yeah, exactly.
3. 1.
The lines we're referring to are marking each eighth note in the bar so that we can see how the shapes fit within them. Thanks. You got it.
And we'll say 4's there?
No, I think 4 is on the C.
On the C?
Yeah.
I think let's put that there. 3 8.5 is actually 17.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's 2 and that's 3, right?
Okay, that's enough to make my point. According to Jessica's explanation, they're making the eighth note beats, quote, so that we can see how the shapes fit within them, end quote. But this is happening at 2 levels. First, the placement of the marks is helping them sort out the rhythms. This is still very early. And second, encountering the marks as they play helps them to anchor the shapes that they're playing, the sounds they're making, between beats, between the large beats, at least for the first few rehearsals. A second type of performance anchor is seen in this session, which is from the fall. This is the first rehearsal back after a several-month break. Here they've just played a passage and stopped. They can't quite figure out what went wrong, so they decide to play it again, and this time it works.
We'll go back to Fraser.
Yeah.
No, I think so.
And then we're supposed to come in together, right?
Yeah.
So
I think we were.
We were.
Yay! We didn't even try. We did. Same thing again?
They get very silly. Okay. So they found a spot where they could land together, which is actually quite rare in the first movement of this piece. And they marked it. So the annotation they make here seals something that worked in that moment that they just played onto the page. It's now there on the score for future recall. I see this as a different process than that of the previous slide, where the process of annotating the music was also a problem-solving activity. A similar non-annotated moment is seen in the next slide.
But the cello was good.
Yeah, the cello was good.
Do it again. And I like when you gesture on that F,
Yeah.
it helps me know exactly where to come in with you there.
Okay. Shall we make that a God moment, just in case? Like, no matter what happens there, like if I sort of give a little nod, then we know.
Yeah.
Go back on there.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
That's
Let's try it again.
Yeah.
So they label his head nod. Instead of writing it on the music, they've transferred that moment to this gesture that he will then repeat in every subsequent performance. And they call that a God moment. This is an anchor for timing in that passage. The point between this and the previous segment is that not all performance anchors are marks on the page, and that's just something that I want to keep coming back to as we're looking at these works. So category 2 annotations show evidence of coordination at the metacognitive layer. When we're looking at annotations from the perspective of coordination over time, we find places where extra emphasis is placed on monitoring and evaluation. The most literal interpretation of this is a correction made to time signatures on the score, revising them from 3.5/8 to 7/16, for example. It isn't necessary to mark that on the page. Performers often subdivide at a smaller count than what's represented in the time signature. But here they made a conscious decision to mark those time signature corrections on the page, in effect editing the score. Other textual markings such as slow in block letters or the word hold and arrows that were used to indicate motion over the bar lines, when examined in the context in which they're made, give evidence of coordination at the metacognitive level, as the transcript on the next slide will demonstrate. So Jessica says, something else I thought of. Marks, yeah? I'm not noticing it if you do it. I notice it when I do it. We get to the end of the phrase, and the phrase endings don't always have a pause. And here Mark interrupts her and says, yeah, we take time. And Jessica finishes, but we take time. So they've confirmed that they're both aware that they've been taking too much time. They've made explicit their processes of monitoring and evaluation. Jessica says, I mean, he's very specific where he puts a fermata over the bar line and where he doesn't. Can we run it again and try to give it more flow between sections? And also, we need to watch the arrows. They had already marked the arrows as annotations to indicate movement through those spots, but she's drawing their attention to them again. This is enough for me to categorize the arrows as a category 2 annotations. However, it's usually easier to assign words to this category. When you see block letters slow, you know that the flutists are focusing on the tempo that they're doing in that passage. So the category 1 is visual salience or perceptual layer. This is the smallest and most pragmatic category of annotations in this analysis. Annotations at this layer are often either overlooked or misinterpreted, especially if one's assuming that all marks are communicative of musical intent. The marks were made simply to increase the chances that the flutist would see the mark while playing the piece. So Jessica stops with a large breath and motion. Can we achel more? Mark says. Achel? We're supposed to achel? Huh, achel means accelerate, accelerando. Huh, look at that, we're achelling. Oh, okay. And they laugh. And then they go on to joke about how the marking really should be on both lines. So it's only marked in the first flute's part, and he really didn't see it. Okay, so then they go and put it on both parts. Another case for these kinds of marks comes from the fact that they were working from a photocopy, which also allowed them to draw all over it. Normally we wouldn't draw over a nice, clean, published score. But the drawback of that is some marks don't come through very well, and they simply had to make them more clear. On the next slide, I'll show you a dynamic marking. This is a little more interesting to look at because usually we assume interpretive intent on those. If someone makes a bigger dynamic marking, we're assuming they mean to play it louder than the composer indicated originally. But in this data, anyway, this wasn't an interpretive decision. So way up there, I don't know if you can see it very well. The second staff, the last bar, you'll see fortissimo piano, FFP. There's a very cluttered area of the score. It's by a corrected time signature. You can see there's a very thin dynamic wedge that's been made much bigger. Well, the very thin wedge has the word molto written over top. And the flutist just simply didn't parse the marking the way it was on the score. They thought it would mean the very same thing. If they just made it bigger, they would see it and have a greater chance of playing it. So this is the score. Just to review, I'm sorry I don't have a laser pointer. I think it would help. There's the block letter slow that I was talking about. Okay, when they put, that's pretty rare to put a marking in block letters on a score. That was indicated of something really important to them. They really had to make sure that they were taking time there. The tempo shifts, okay, it goes up to 60 and then back down to 38. So they're really emphasizing the marking at the top. The triangles that you see, whenever they see those, they're counting 1, 2, 3. Okay, so if a measure has 5 counts to it, it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So that's linking up directly with their counting that they're doing in their minds with what they're seeing on the score. If they really weren't necessary, I don't think they would draw them in. Now, I'm going to add something to this. In our dress rehearsal at UBC, we'd been bumped from the recital hall, which is where they were going to be performing, into the old auditorium. This is before the old auditorium was renovated. The flutists that day forgot their annotated score. We were bumped from our room. The old Odd was a very noisy old building with no electrical outlets, so I had to, scramble to get everything set up. It was a perfect situation to see what happens to people under pressure. Having forgotten the annotated score, first of all, the first thing I noticed watching them was that their volume of body motion increased greatly. It was very, very obvious, where before, if they had made a small movement like this, it was much bigger. So I asked them about it. I said, what's going on? How do you feel playing from a clean score? Jessica says, I'm more alert as I'm watching the score, and Mark concurs. Jessica adds, having had our own little map out there, I'm actually aware of things I might have taken for granted. And Mark adds, because they've been removed, I'm actually more alert about them. So this was a really interesting observation, which speaks to something that many of us know about who study cognition, and that is that there's a lot of redundancy built into our coordination systems for music making. We've looked at a little bit of that in terms of overlap between body motion and annotation. But these allow for some flexibility and creativity in performance situations. And this is an area that we often play with as performers. We'll change a constraint, or we'll make something a little different to change our processes of attention, to make it more creative, more spontaneous in practice. And this just allows us to see some of that happening. I have 2 more slides. I think I have time, maybe a little bit of time, to show 2 more slides of the flutists marking what they call big beats, one with pencil on the score, one with body motion, just so that we can see one more time evidence of this redundancy.
I'm wondering, I'm going to try and be a little more visual with where at least I think the beats are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tapping my foot, so
Yeah.
I don't know if you can see it at all.
Nope.
Okay, that's okay.
So I might keep
Yeah.
it more upper body, I think. So.
Okay. Make sure you're not subdividing where triplets or anything. Just
Right.
beats.
All right.
All right, it's okay. Should we start maybe?
I would mind 14 again would be great.
Okay.
It's 14.
So I don't know if you caught that. He says, I'm going to use more upper body motion. She says, I'm tapping my foot. Can you see it? No. The only reservation she has about him using upper body motion is that she doesn't want him doing moving a lot on the subdivisions. She wants him only working on the big beats because otherwise it gets too distracting in performance. This is from the second rehearsal. The second example we have of that is again from the fall.
I've subdivided too much here, I think. I think that's all this time. Big beats, big beats, big beats.
Big beats, big beats, big beats. And there he erases some smaller stuff and just marks the big beats.
4, 5, right? Mm-hmm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
So this video and the previous one show us a common theme in the coordination of this piece, an emphasis on the big beats. If you remember the music from the opening recording, did any of you find the beat? I would be really impressed if you did, okay? Because it's deliberately obscured in this score. So what they mean by big beats is really quite an abstract concept. It's shifting every measure, okay? They have to focus on the eighth note count in most situations. So they're using both the annotations and the body motion to make that count explicit for coordination. It's not just something that they're counting in their heads and then it's together. They actually have to bridge that through these other means. So, annotations allow us to conceptualize coordination at the perceptual, cognitive, and metacognitive layers. Comparing coordination across domains, for example, comparing annotations with body motions and conventions of performance, will give us insight into areas where the boundaries between individuals become more and more transparent through the process of making music. And this is the most exciting part of this work for me, is we often talk about music connecting people, but what does that really mean beyond just the fact that it connects us? And this way we can at least conceptualize ways in which we are thinking the same, coordinating our behaviors in a similar way in several different layers. And I find that really quite fascinating. Future work, I'm going to UCSD very soon to look at what it means to think instrumentally, both in solo and ensemble work. What does it mean when I'm a person-instrument system? What does thinking in music as a bassoonist mean, as opposed to thinking in music as a pianist, for example, or as a dancer? I'm still working on expanding different domains of coordination. So the 4 I came up with for my dissertation actually worked, but there's many different ways of looking at that and more things to be included there. Breath, for example, performers are wind players, very interested in breath. And there's really a lot of degrees of movement there to coordinate music. I'm also, hopefully at UCSD, going to do some cross-domain analyses. So compare a cognitive layer, counting with body motion and conventions of performance. I'm really interested in this, conceptualizing how the boundaries between performers become transparent. I think that's a really interesting thing to think about and look at, especially when we're trying to make a case for music and music education in contemporary society. Why is it good to play an instrument instead of just listening to an iPod? And to me, this is really the key right there, is being able to look at exactly what it is that music does for us when we're playing together. I'd like to thank UBC Magic for giving me a home, and my graduate committee, as well as Jessica and Mark, the two flutists in my study, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. That was great. Do you want to handle your own questions? Do you want me to? We're going to take questions. Okay. Would you like to handle? Sure. I can run the microphone to the questioner, so stick up your hand if you have questions.
I was just... Sorry. Amazing. I was just curious, the two performers were working off the same score?
Yes.
Yeah, is that common?
No, not so common. I mean, it's not uncommon, but for duets, you're often on the same score.
Okay.
But that was something they had to do because of the complexity of this work.
It really wouldn't have worked for them to be standing in separate places, reading off of different.
Especially if there are parts, if they just had single lines, I can imagine it would have been much harder to coordinate this.
Yeah, me too. I play flute.
Pardon me?
I play flute.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah. Not professionally, but I play duets with.
Oh, yeah. So
yeah.
when you read duets, often you'll have, sometimes you'll have the duets on the same score, and sometimes you'll have separate sheets.
Right.
I don't know if I'd recommend anyone play this piece, with single lines.
I don't think so.
When you see the extensive beat marking they had to do to coordinate, you see how important it is for those both parts to be there. Now, they play other pieces as well. These two play together a lot. They play Bach and, other pieces that have a more regular beat. But for this particular work, and that's something that's important to remember about qualitative research, we're looking at a particular case, and we're not generalizing to
what goes on elsewhere. We're looking at what's unique and what this particular case can tell us about coordination.
Okay, thank you.
I wonder if you could give some examples of performance convention, because I understood annotation, body movement, and I'm wondering what comprises.
Thanks for asking that, actually. So conventions of performance, things that we end up, we learn in our lessons with our teachers that we end up forgetting by the time we're my age. But often, for example, there's 3 stages of sitting with your instrument. There's rest position, there's ready position, and there's play position. Okay? So, most studios will teach something like that for an ensemble setting. Conventions of performance can include, for flute players, how to conduct while you're playing. Mark talked about teaching his students how to make visible what it was they were doing. So if you're playing it and you're just standing like this, for example, and you're playing, people can't really tell what you're doing. You're not really showing them with your body. It's not that you make a big production of it, but you breathe and you play. And part of it is the mechanics of playing an instrument. Part of it is the mechanics of playing in an ensemble. So the convention is you breathe and you play. There's a rhythm to it. And different studios will differ a little bit. As a bassoonist, different studios have different approaches to breathing, for example, tone production. But there's a lot of commonality. In an ensemble setting, the first flute player is the leader. Second flute player is the follower, unless the musical lines are switched, So it's little rules like that help us make music together, that we learn from our teachers, we learn at a music school, and that we then go into the professional world and use. Does that answer your question?
So which aspects of body motion or which specific body motions are not performance convention?
Well, I would say most of them are. I mean, there's, for instance, when the two flutists were talking about tapping or moving the upper body. So they were actually referring to a bit of a debate in terms of body motion in ensemble performance, where some believe I've even read in some literature on performance that you're only supposed to limit your body motion to the tapping of your toe inside your shoe so as not to distract your fellow musicians, right? And there's others who believe that you have to move, not only to play your instrument, but the music is part of the system that you're moving in as well. And so there's disagreement, and what they were doing was trying to find some kind of common ground where they could actually use. She's very solid. She doesn't move as much as Mark. Mark moves quite a lot. So they're sort of, so those are both personality characteristics and conventions of performance that are sort of coming together, and they're working them through in that rehearsal setting. And that's the kind of thing that happens a lot in rehearsal, when especially people coming together from different schools or different ensembles, they have to negotiate. Some of those things and other things, they just go by unspoken. I didn't actually go into that in as much depth as I could for my thesis, but it is a really interesting area. Anybody else have a question? Yeah. Conducting.
Yeah. And annotation and body movement.
Comment on it?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure quite. Do you have a question about conducting that you want me to think about, or?
Related to what we just saw, to people playing together, somebody else giving them instructions.
Well, you know, obviously a conductor is only employed when it's a much larger ensemble. What I'm looking at here is just 2 people. So 2 to 5 to 8, even there's even orchestras that can play together without a conductor, like the Orpheus Chamber Ensemble. But you know, I have done some orchestral performance. It's a different thing. I don't know whether you want me to think about the role of the conductor or what it's like to play with a conductor versus playing in an ensemble.
Yeah,
playing, yeah. Well, you're still aware when you're sitting, obviously, if you're in that situation, you're going to be sitting. And Elaine is, we are very lucky to have a longtime professional oboist in the room who may want to speak to this more than I do. The conductor's role, some conductors will be very rigid about how much you need to follow them. They want to give you everything, right? Other conductors want to bring things out of you. No matter what the conductor is doing, as a performer, you're still coordinating with however number of people that you're sitting with in the group. And, you know, everything that I talked about here and more, you have to be aware of as a player. So there's a lot more cognitive load than just having your instrument and playing your part. You're aware of the concertmaster, you're aware of the row in front of you, the people beside you, you're aware of the trombones in the back. If you ever stand behind an ensemble when they're playing, in fact, I recommend it if you're curious. Go behind the trombone section for a really big piece, working on a Mahler or something. And just watch that row of people play. It's really astounding. You see them, the entire row will be like this. They'll move. And you can see they're playing in their body motion together. And the most powerful example I have of that in my own experience was playing Beethoven's 8th Symphony with everybody in the woodwind section just coming into phase and playing a series of 8th note beats together. That's done, you know, through a lot of practice, but also through an ability to be aware of what's happening around you. The conductor can't give you that, right? You have to be able to do that with the people that are sitting around you. Do you have anything you want to say about, you know, the work I'm talking about here is really chamber music, but I think he's asking a question about playing in orchestra and how that may be similar or different.
I think it's got a lot to do with the complexity of the music. The concertmaster used to lead the orchestra way back in early times, and then music got so complex that wasn't possible anymore. So that's when the conductor came into play. But for myself, there are no words to describe how I played with my section. We breathe together, we move together, and we play together. Basically, that's it.
Does that answer your question? The only other thing you asked was about annotation. And I found it in Megan Wingett's study really interesting because she took a lot of data about marks performers make on scores and whether or not they bring a pencil, what they say about their annotating when they play. And she found a fairly big difference between the amount of marking that chamber musicians do versus orchestral musicians at the same level of training and professionalism. And I don't know whether that says anything or not, but it's simply interesting. It'd be interesting to take it further. Not a lot of work has been done. But you'll see conductor scores are often quite annotated. So.
I have a question.
Yes.
On one of your last slides, you talked about, I think you talked about individual boundaries and how they tend to, those individual boundaries get lost, and there's a sort of a transparency. So we've all, regardless of, I've had a fair bit of experience with ensemble choral singing in smaller groups and in larger choirs, and so in choruses, and so there's getting things technically right and having the same beat and having the same performance plan and having things beautiful, and then you're adding layers of artistry, right, and expression, and then there's the magical performance, right, where my experience is more in singing, where it's like you can have all these voices, and even if it's multiple harmonies, it comes out as one voice. It sounds like one voice. So how would you characterize that? And would it be performance metrics? Would it be? How does that actually come about, do you think?
Well, there's a couple of parts to that question. First of all, the product, which is the beautiful music that's being performed. You can hear, you can think of that as just connecting people. What I'm looking at here really is a lot about processes of attention and awareness in performance. So when the whole process of rehearsing is to cultivate enough common ground that we can experience something together at the same time and interpret it in such a way that we're doing it exactly the same way. It's not rigid like a recording. It's flexible, right? There are changes in the environment. It's a work that comes alive. That magic of the performance is still there. But I'm really interested in just how we can conceptualize the different layers of connection between our processes of attention and awareness. So we're counting exactly the same. We've rehearsed this, several times. We know what shape we were talking about creating there. We're both aware of the sound, and we can both perceive the sound happening and the way it's shaping. And we're both moving that sound and shaping it together at the same time as being aware of all these other things, including the mechanics of our own singing or playing our instrument. So to me, just thinking about it and being able to draw it out and to go, oh, this is, a metacognitive, right? We're aware that we were going to slow down. Here we're counting. And just being able to conceptualize all of that, for me, when I say it makes the boundaries transparent, I think what it really does is show how much common experience we're carrying through. I think some of us, you don't want to think, to what extent we're connected to other people, but certainly with respect to music, that's a very important reason why many of us play, and we can call it magic, and it is, but we can also conceptualize all of the different ways it happens. And I think also thinking about it as a performer and knowing that and going into your rehearsal setting helps you to be aware of, how you might cultivate certain aspects of that in a more positive way as well. Some of us who play, in the classical music world, we often have different issues we need to work through with people, right, as we're making music with them. And I think just being aware of these things is quite powerful. Brings a powerful component of music making into the situation. So it's not just something that we're doing for money or for some other reason, right? It's something that's actually got some kind of real human value. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I don't have the answer either. Right. I guess what I see is I'm not referring to the product. I am referring to the process of the performer in the group that's doing the performer. Like you're in there, in the moment. And I understand all the layers. As a researcher, I understand all the layers. But as a performer, it's just, what gives rise to the peak musical performance, right? And when you're with the group, it has something to do with those boundaries almost disappearing, right? That you are almost performing as one unit because of that shared experience and thousands of hours of practice and so on.
Yeah, and it gets into another area, which I haven't really studied that well, but sort of flow theory, and that kind of thing. I'm still quite mechanical here. Yep.
Maybe one more question? Can we do that?
Yeah. Do you have a question? Yes, I do. Here you go. Do I need this? No problem. I'm an educational psychologist. Okay. Want this for the recording? Yeah. I'm an educational psychologist, and one of the features of learners is that they come to learning activities with frames of mind that influence what they do. And I'm wondering a bit about that characterization in your context with respect to a difference in what people may hold as their latitude for interpretation, and whether in this context or perhaps conjecturing beyond it, you have some thoughts about that particular sense that these two performers had and the ways in which there may have been interactions with the annotations they made and consequently your interpretations about the making of music. Was that clear at all?
Right.
So, it seems to me that in some senses these people were attempting to stick to what they perceived the composer to have in mind for the expression of the music. In fact, it seemed to me that was quite prominent. But if I understood some of what their exchanges were about, there were some places where they were taking a little latitude with that. Does the annotation reflect that, or is the opportunity for instance, the symbols available in annotation constraining on the latitude that they may have taken with the interpretation?
Well, first of all, I think they were really, that's such an interesting question, right? When we pick up a score, and we've heard a number of recordings of the work, where do we find the interpretation that we want to make? Why are we playing it? What are we going to pull out of this piece? The flutists, I think, really were interested in performing their version of the work, but they were very cognizant of trying to create the work that Takemitsu intended them to play. I wouldn't have thought that they took any latitude, in fact, with interpreting something that he wanted them to do. I'm going through all the rehearsals in my mind and the performance, and I think their intention, their primary aim was really to create a performance of the work that was intended by the composer. Both of them, Mark does a lot of improvisation, Jessica less so, but she actually does some. And they're very clear about where those boundaries are. And because this score is so precise, everything is notated. It's a very, very precisely notated score. They really had to stay within the constraints of what the composer wanted. The only thing they edited was changing the count, right? So 3.5, 8 is really kind of awkward to count in your mind. 7/16 is easier. So they're really only writing things on the score to make it easier for them to play what they figured he wanted, right? And I really think that was their aim. I didn't see them doing anything that would have been construed as recomposing the work at all. Yeah. Did that answer your... Was that... Okay, yeah.
Are we going to tackle it?
Sure.
I think my question is in the same direction, but from a different point of view. How do they know that they've got it right? The way they were discussing it, it seemed to me that they would be satisfied when it was to their mutual agreement and satisfaction and something they both liked, and that was good enough. They could move on to another part. If they had been two students who couldn't stand Takemitsu, huge fans of John Philip Sousa, and were trying to draw the composition in that direction, it would have turned out fairly differently, I think. And so they must have started out as devotees of that genre of music, and that was partway through to the goal. And if it was to their mutual considerable satisfaction, that was their metric for judging whether they had a success.
Well, they're measuring success also based on their ability to read that score. I mean, they can read it. They know what the markings mean and what the count is, and they know whether or not they've performed the rhythm correctly. And so because the score is very precise, there is really not as much room for them to compose or to, I mean, yeah.
But they could have
They're
fed,
working it out.
They could have fed that notation into a synthesizer, like a sequencer, and had a computer-generated rendering which would have taken everything into account and been note and time perfect, listened to it and said, okay, I guess that's what we have to do, and then maybe added subtle inflection to make it more human.
It's a really
that sort of
interesting question that you're raising. It really gets to the value and experience of working it out creatively through rehearsal. And there are some, that is kind of a philosophical question. Why should humans make music, right? Instead of putting it in, as you say, through a computer. But there were passages that I didn't show you where, and it happened very, very often in rehearsal, they would rehearse something, it was wrong. They rehearsed it again, it's still wrong. They talk about it, they write something, they fix it, they rehearse it again. They rehearse it. 6 times they rehearse it, they're always stopping. 7th time, or whatever number time, they rehearse it and they go on. And they never say another word. Because it's there, right? They've reached what it was they were aiming for, they've corrected it, they've established it, they've even worked it out and played it correctly more than once, which is something that they do often, and then they just go on to something else. And so they do have something correct that they're aiming for that they then achieve, right? But then when it gets to the performance, these redundancies come in, right? And that allows the performance to shape and move, and that's what sort of makes the piece come alive as it does for that final performance. Was that satisfactory?
I want to comment on your question.
Okay.
Hey, is that okay?
Yeah.
I don't want to take your thunder.
So I wanted to comment on your question about taking the score as written and putting it into a computer-generated synthesizer, and it is a very heated discussion, I guess, at music conferences. But Alf Gabrielson and many other people who have studied rhythm and timing and performance in music have shown that scores as written are not performed with the timing as written. So I found really interesting in your talk the point about their importance of finding the big beats in each of the bars, because even in a real metrically written, specified performance, the first beat of the bar and so on, they aren't performed with exactly equal duration. So otherwise it just sounds really boring and mechanical to a human listener, to the hearer, to our perception, right?
Well, the composer could have written rubato over a section, and I would really like to see what the computer would do with that. This is the opposite of that, I suppose. If you had a capture system where someone who loved the music and knew exactly what it was about played it, the capture system placed it into musical notation, you would get something like that. There are pieces of music that our band has done where I've written out vocal parts, and there is there are elements of vibrato, some of which are driven by the lyrics, and some of which just by the feel. You could write it out legit or straight and play it through a synthesizer, it would sound awful. What you can do is micro-change it into 30 seconds and dotted fractions of notes, and you can get it pretty darn close to the inflected version of it. And so that's what I was reminded of in seeing this highly complex score. It's as if that had happened. But I'm sure the composer didn't do that, but you could get to a similar looking result that way.
Well, you should listen to the piece and you look at it with the score. It's quite an interesting, complex work structurally. It's not just random. Is that what you're saying? It's the composition itself is quite is structurally coherent.
Yes. It's the departures from strict regularity have musical meaning.
Yeah.
Humans know that without having to be told. You can put them on the page, as we've seen here.
Yeah.
And so you can either write it simply and have the musician fill all that in themselves.
Well, you know what? I do think about this with this work, and the Takemitsu, the first movement, the way he writes it is purposefully to obscure the pulse, right? So the flutists have to find that in themselves and perform what that is, and that's gets to a cultural foundation for playing music. He's Japanese, Western Japanese composer as well. But it also gives the music its sense of coherence as well. It's speeding up, it's slowing down, there's emotion in it. There are things that are recalled, but they're recalled a third lower. You're asking questions about the musical meaning and where that's coming from. And my feeling about that, whether or not you could play it through a computer, is that the human coming to make that piece, to make sense of it through their own experience, that's where the music is being made, right? It's being experienced, it's being created each time it's performed. For example, the body motion, sight reading, the same passage of music, the same 3 measures of music. You take a video clip of it, the first session, third session, dress rehearsal, and the performance. Turn off the sound. Look at them, very same passage of music. It looks like they're not playing the same piece. It's that different. So what is that, right? What does that do to our notion of how this music, where it comes from? For me, I found that very, very interesting. That was a pivotal, that was an insight, aha moment for me looking at the data. Is that, so much of the literature tells us that it comes from the notation. But how much of the music really does come from that? And how much of it comes from the people who are making it, who are listening and creating and cultivating it through these other different layers? And to me, that's what I'm interested in. So, anyway, I think we've gone over time. Sorry.
Well,
thank you very much. It's been a very nice discussion.
Yeah, so we thank you for great questions and for the talk that gave us a place for our imaginations to go. Really, you've kicked off the series in its style, and I do want to remind you of the other 4 speakers that will be coming in the series. The next one is on the 19th, and it's Veronica Zamito, and she will be talking about the user experience in video games, so we take a completely different shift. She's coming to us from electronic arts. She's also doing her PhD in CIAT at SFU. So I really encourage students to come back for that one in particular if you're interested in user interface. And she's going to give some tips actually on how it really works. The other 3 talks that follow is the concept a useful concept. From a psychologist here at SFU, Kathleen Slaney, on the 16th of November, Honing Theory, a Complex Systems-Inspired View of Creativity, Leanne Gawara, from UBC, the Departments of Psychology. And the last in our series will be November 23rd, and that'll be Affective Communication Through Touch. So we return to a form of haptics touch sensation after talking with Christine earlier today. And that's Karen McLean, also from UBC Department of Computer Science. All of these, as you can see, really a diverse selection of talks, but nice to have all of the same people back and more to explore them. There's more information on the website. Each of the talks are in detail there. Expect to see some posters around campus. Look for those. They'll look like this. And also a series poster that you can forward to your friends, because I'll email them to you. It's been a great pleasure to have you here, and come back again. Thank you.
Thank you.